In this lesson, we'll be talking about particles of matter, and also about how our understanding of these particles has changed as a scientific community over time. There are two objectives that you are going to need to keep an eye on. The first is explain how atoms are the particles that make up all matter, and the second is to describe how scientific theories about atoms have changed. Make sure you're able to do both of those things at the end of our lesson today. So atoms are the smallest particles of an element. And when I say small, I mean really, really, really small. A penny, for instance, not that big, right, contains 20,000 billion atoms. That's a huge number for something that fits so easily in the palm of your hand. If we were to take that and flip it and look at the atom instead of at a larger object made of atoms, the average atom has a diameter, remember that's the distance across of the circle, an average diameter of 3/100 millionths of a centimeter. Talk about small. If you're interested in learning a little bit more about this, the video that you see on the screen called Just How Small is an Atom is an awesome resource. It's going to help to put this idea of the size of an atom in context using things that you understand and have seen and know the size of. So I'll post the link to this video on my website. If you are feeling like you don't know what you're going to do over spring break, and I understand you probably want to take a break and relax a little bit too, but if you get bored, I have a challenge for you to try at home. This will be an option for you all the way through the end of spring break. Prizes will be given to the people that complete this challenge the most successfully. And I want to stress as well, it is totally optional. This is not homework. But basically what you need to do if you want to complete the Board at Home challenge is find a piece of 8.5 by 11 paper. This is the size of an average or a standard piece of printer paper. So the white stuff that goes in your printer, the stuff that homework's usually printed out on, that's what you're looking for. What you're going to need to do is tear or cut that piece of paper in half, and you can go hot dog way, hamburger way, totally doesn't matter. After you've cut it in half once, you are going to fold it and cut it in half again. Keep cutting or tearing your paper until each piece is so small that you can't make the halves any smaller. Now feel free to get creative. Don't necessarily stop when it gets to be too hard to tear or too hard to cut with a piece of or a pair of scissors. You can keep going. Try to make them as small as possible. I applaud your creativity. Once you're done, what you're going to want to do is take a picture of the mound of tiny paper pieces that you have left behind. Once you've done that, you can clear most of them off, but save one. You're going to need to use a ruler to measure one of the small pieces. It doesn't matter which one, because if you are cutting in half exactly, all the pages or all the paper should be about the same size. You're going to want to measure that small piece in centimeters, please, so you know about how small it is, and then take a picture of that piece next to your ruler. To submit all of this for the challenge, you're going to want to go to my website. I will be putting a Google form up that you can submit the photos, both photos, the length measurement from your ruler, and also your address too. The reason I need your address is because the student that's able to cut or tear or use some other creative method to make their paper down to the smallest dimension will be mailed a prize after spring break. So something to keep in mind, you do not have to do this. Again, I'm going to stress that. It's optional, but if you're bored, give it a shot. Now to talk about atomic theory. This is how our understanding of the atom has changed over time. So the story begins back in 440 BCE with a Greek philosopher whose name was Democritus. He thought that if you were to take something like a sheet of paper and cut it in half over and over and over again, eventually you would end up with a piece that is so small that it can no longer be cut in half again. And he called this smallest thing atomos. The word atomos means not able to be divided in Latin. So he wasn't able to actually test this theory. They didn't have the scientific tools for him to be able to do that, but conceptually to him, this just made sense. To kind of go along with his theory about atomos, he also posited that all of these atoms, all these things that could no longer be divided, were small hard particles, meaning that they were solid and they had mass. He also thought that these atoms were made up of, or all atoms were made of single materials formed in different shapes and sizes. So in other words, he thought that all of the different types of matter we see around us weren't a result or aren't a result of different elements, different atomic pieces, he thought that they were a result of the same atom being arranged in a whole bunch of different shapes and sizes. Now, unfortunately for Democritus, there was another Greek philosopher around during this time named Aristotle, and you might have heard of him. He was very, very famous. Aristotle disagreed with Democritus's theory about atomos. He thought that it was impossible to cut something down so that it was so small it could not be cut again. And because Aristotle disagreed with Democritus, and because Aristotle was so popular, people sort of forgot about Democritus and what he had said. They decided Aristotle was right. Remember that they couldn't test any of these theories back then. They didn't have the resources to do that. So they were operating based on the authority of the people having the ideas. Now here's the sad thing. That was 440 BC. Now we have to fast forward over 1,000 years to the late 1700s. In the late 1700s, science had come a fair ways. Scientists were starting to understand elements. They were starting to understand compounds, this idea that elements could be combined. But they hadn't made it much beyond identifying these things existed. John Dalton, a scientist from about that era, late 1700s, early 1800s, set out to understand this concept of compounds even better. So he made a lot of different tests, ran a lot of different tests, and his results suggested that these elements that had been newly discovered could be combined in certain ratios. And the reason they could be combined in these ratios into compounds was because each atom was unique. So in other words, John Dalton was positing that the hydrogen atom had a different something to it, he didn't know what, from an oxygen atom. And because these two atoms were unique but compatible, they could combine to form a substance like H2O, like water. Dalton compiled all of his theories in 1803 into one atomic theory, and his atomic theory had three parts. It basically said that all substances are made of atoms, that the atom is a small particle that can't be created, divided, or destroyed, basically that everything, doesn't matter what, everything is made up of atoms. The second part of his theory was that atoms of the same element are exactly alike, and atoms of different elements are different. So the hydrogen atom is going to look exactly the same as the next hydrogen atom, and it's going to look totally different from the oxygen atom. But the oxygen atom will look like the oxygen atom. Pretty simple when we stop to think about it, but to them, back before they understood any of this, it was revolutionary. Dalton's third point in his atomic theory was that atoms join together with other atoms to make new substances, and that sort of ties back to his initial quest, which was to better understand compounds. Now, by the end of the 1800s, scientists had begun to notice some inaccuracies in what Dalton had posited back in 1803. The theory began to change as a result. In 1897, J.J. Thomson, another scientist, discovered that there can be small particles inside of an atom. In other words, the atom was not the smallest thing that existed. There were smaller parts within an atom. Thomson noticed this because he was working with positively charged plates. He discovered that negatively charged particles inside atoms were attracted to these positively charged plates. He isolated this negatively charged piece and gave it the name electron. So an electron is a subatomic particle that has a negative charge. When we say subatomic, we just mean it's smaller than an atom. Thomson took his theory, his discovery, a step further, and he proposed a model. Remember, a model is just a representation of a scientific theory or concept. So after discovering electrons, Thomson proposed what he called the plum pudding model. He thought that electrons were mixed throughout atoms like plums in a plum pudding. Now, you and I probably think plum pudding is pretty gross. Thomson really liked it. I prefer to think of this in terms of chocolate chip cookies. So instead of saying that the electrons were mixed through the atom like plums in a pudding, we might say that Thomson thought that the atoms were mixed together like chocolate chips inside a chocolate chip cookie, so scattered all the way through. In 1909, so we're fast forwarding again a healthy number of years, Ernest Rutherford, who studied under J.J. Thomson for a period of time in university, designed an experiment that was designed, or intended to study the different parts of an atom. Keep in mind that the only part we know exists right now is the electron. What he did is he aimed positively charged particles at a target on a thin sheet of gold, and he watched to see whether those particles hit the target like they were supposed to, or if they bounced back in other directions. Remember, positive and negative charges are supposed to locked together, like a positive and negative terminal on a magnet. He was surprised to notice that some of the particles bounced back. In other words, not everything inside an atom is negative. Some of those particles that were positive bounced back. They were repelled like two positive sides on a magnet would repel against one another. Rutherford discovered protons. A proton is a positively charged particle inside the nucleus of an atom. So in order to explain these new observations by Ernest Rutherford, the atomic theory had to change. Now, instead of thinking of the atom like plums in a plum pudding with electrons scattered throughout, scientists began to think of the atom as being made up of mostly empty space, with tiny parts of dense material in the center and tiny parts of negatively charged material floating around the outside. In 1911, Rutherford proposed that the center of the atom was tiny and extremely dense and positively charged. He called this tiny, dense region in the center of an atom the nucleus. Fast forward just a few years to 1913, and Niels Bohr, who studied under Ernest Rutherford, you're going to notice all these guys have connections once we start operating in the 1800s and 1900s. So Niels Bohr studied the way the atoms react to light, and his results led him to create a new hypothesis. He started to think that electrons moved around the nucleus in certain paths or energy levels. He created a model, like the one that you see on the screen, that posited that electrons could jump between these energy levels, but they couldn't sit in between them. In other words, these two electrons floating in the first energy level can't sit in the middle of these rings. They would have to, if they were going to move, jump to the next ring, just one past. Now, in the mid-1900s, Erwin Schrödinger and Werner Heisenberg developed an even better explanation for how these electrons move around in the nucleus. They hypothesized that electrons don't travel in energy levels like Niels Bohr had thought. They say that, in fact, the exact path of an electron can't be predicted. And so that brings us to the atomic theory of today, which basically just states that there are regions inside an atom where electrons are likely to be found. And now keep in mind, too, that this atomic theory is based on not just Schrödinger and Heisenberg's work, but also all of the scientists that came before, all the way through to Democritus back in 1440. Schrödinger and Heisenberg decided that, ran tests that showed that these electrons, instead of existing in energy levels, rather exist in an electron cloud, which is a region around the nucleus. And you can see a picture of an electron cloud here on the screen. Now, we've talked about protons, we've talked about electrons. The one particle that we haven't talked about inside of an atom is the neutron. The neutron was discovered somewhere in between the time of J.J. Thomson and Niels Bohr. And since the neutron doesn't have a charge positively or negatively, its real role is in affecting atomic mass, which we'll talk about later on in our chapter. Your work for today is to finish up those 1.3 notes. Remember, they are due today at 2 p.m. There's also a feedback form that I would like you to fill out. Hopefully it takes you no more than 3 to 5 minutes. I basically just ask, how are things going? How are you doing? What's going well? What's not going so well? That way, I have some time over spring break to make some changes to hopefully have an even better version of our science class ready to go in the week following. So I will see you later. Let me know if you have any questions or if there's anything I can help with.